All right. Hello, everyone. How's everyone doing today? Thanks for tuning in. This is an educational channel. We check out great theories and discoveries that are very impactful, but you probably haven't heard of them before. This is Bible Decode number 252, and we've been exploring the implications, ramifications, and ins and outs of the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. That is, that the New Testament was not written by Jesus' apostles and so on, but by the Roman Caesars of the Flavian dynasty. That is Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian, from 69 to 96 AD. And they wrote the Gospels and backdated the story by about 40 years. Set it in the early 30s AD, late 20s, early 30s. And they did this as a psychological operation, a weapon of psychological warfare for the Romans against the Jews. The Jews had been a major thorn in the side of the Romans for well over 100 years. Constant uprisings, revolts, revolutions, insurrections, riots, and so on, culminating in the war from 66 to 73 AD. Both emperors Titus and Vespasian were generals in that war, and they were both wounded in the war. And they both were really kind of just sick and tired of dealing with all the militancy of the Jews. And so they recognized that the Jews were waiting for a Messiah, a military commander that would help them overthrow the Romans. So instead, the Romans wrote a story about a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, walking the extra mile with the Roman soldiers' pack, turning the other cheek to oppression, advising things like loving your enemies and not that that's a bad thing, but it's just what the Romans wanted, you know. It's a limited hangout. There's plenty of good stuff in the New Testament, but the fact of the matter is that it was written by the Romans. The Romans wanted the Jews to be good citizens in their empire. That's why they wrote these, because the Jews were super high maintenance with all their revolts, more high maintenance than any other group of people that the Romans controlled there in that empire in the first century. And so, you know, they wrote all this about the Jewish Messiah, but made him very deferential to the Romans, and at the same time very antagonistic to the Jews, overturning the tables of the money changers at the temple, who were trading out the dirty Roman money for the kosher Jewish money, so that that the sacrificial animals can be bought and sold. And Jesus struck out after those merchants as well, Jewish merchants. Jesus had an antagonism to the family, which somehow has not been preserved by Christians these days. I find that the Christians of today have really had pretty good instincts about what part of Christianity to ignore and what part to embrace. But certainly, Jesus is encouraging his disciples to completely abandon their families without even an explanation or a notice of them leaving. So the Jesus that is composed by the Romans, is very, very pro-Roman and anti-Jew. But as we move through the New Testament, we see that Paul is even more pro-Roman and anti-Jew than Jesus was. And that's basically the topic here for this episode. Is we're in the conclusion of this book called Operation Messiah by Thies Voskuilen and Rosemary Sheldon, which argues that Paul, now not completely on board with the Roman origins hypothesis, but just leaning in that direction. And so they suggest that Paul was an intelligence agent of the Romans, a spy for the Romans who faked his conversion to Christianity on the road to Damascus and then tried to infiltrate the Nazarene movements. And the Nazarenes were much more of a threat to the Romans than, say, Jesus was. Jesus was somewhat of a threat. In spite of his deferential stance, Jesus was still somewhat of a threat to the Romans because of just the chaos factor. The Jews hated him, and he antagonized the Jews, and so they're, overturning the tables of the money changers is certainly something that might start a riot. So the Romans had to police that, and so Jesus was still somewhat of a threat. I mean, this is, if you believe the story, the Roman origins hypothesis indicates that the entire thing is fiction and none of this happened. It may have been, modeled on somebody who actually existed. Maybe. But anyway, so the authors of this book do believe that the story is true and it existed and Jesus existed and Paul existed. But they do believe that Paul was a spy for the Romans. He was a fraud, or he was, undercover. Now, if you want more evidence for the Roman origins hypothesis, you can watch just about any one of my prior 250 videos on this subject. The evidence hasn't I didn't even scratch the surface of it on this video. It is pretty overwhelming in my opinion, and it's extremely explanatory. It explains just a lot of the anomalies of, Christian theology that haven't been able to be explained. Can be explained pretty easily when you consider that the Romans wrote the Gospels as a psychological operation to mellow out the Jews, to tame the Jews, or to domesticate the Jews, get them to obey the Romans a little bit more. And the Romans had the motive, obviously, the means, and the opportunity, given that the Romans had a monopoly on censorship, on publishing, and on distribution, as well as the MO. The Romans had created other religions for psychological purposes at this very time. And how they did it is they wrote the Gospels to break the code. You have to look at both the Gospels and a history that was written about the Jewish war from 66 to 73 AD that features Titus and Vespasian. And this 7-volume book is called Jewish War, written by a person named Josephus, a person named Flavius Josephus, indicating that he is a family member of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars, featuring Titus and Vespasian. And don't know about the real existence of Josephus or Josephus, but if you dig into Josephus, you will notice that there are uncanny parallels with the New Testament, such that you must conclude that whoever was Josephus or Josephus was also the author of the New Testament. So we know Josephus emanated from Rome. He lived at Caesar's palace as one of the court historians of the Romans, highly endorsed by Titus, and whoever he was or they, have so many parallels between the New Testament and Josephus. Michael Menescot's, in his new book called Christianity's Origin as a Flavian Secrecy Cult, found over 250 parallel themes or motifs with a thick description. Some of the parallels are quite intricate and detailed, leaving very, very little room for coincidence, especially given that Menescot's found over 250 of them just in the book of Luke. And Joseph Atwill, in his book Caesar's Messiah, discovered that the ministry of Jesus is nothing more than a model of the military campaign of Titus. Every place that Titus goes, Jesus also goes in the same order, and they encounter parallel events at each locale that are spaced out by exactly 40 years. So they have parallel, stints in Judea. And we're not just talking about a few events, we're talking about over 40 of them. Now, these folks who wrote Operation Messiah didn't necessarily know about this other scholarship that talks about the Roman origins hypothesis. And so they end up doing a lot of contorting and a lot of kind of backflips and somersaults to be able to make their points. The first area where they kind of steer off the course is by noticing the blatant pro-Romanism and anti-Jewism of Paul, but not noticing it in the case of Jesus. Even though Jesus is not to the extent of Paul, but it's still pretty clear. But they instead point out how Jesus was a threat, not because of anything that he did, but just because of the chaos factor. And so that kind of gets them off the track. And but other than that, they do bring up a lot of interesting points about Paul that are pretty much irreconcilable with this being a legitimate history. Particularly for me, when Paul as a prisoner of the Romans is allowed to stop and give a speech to his followers when he is under, being held as a prisoner. Also, just the illogicality of the conversion on the road to Damascus. Paul is with a bunch of Romans. They're persecuting these people, and then Paul has his conversion experience, and then he just says, "Hey, I'm out. I'm on the other team now," and they just let him walk. So that's not what would happen. Okay, so we'll start here and see. We might even finish today. It may seem ironic that much of the pagan hostility aimed at Paul was because pagans mistook him for a Messianic Jew. This was what he was posing as, and to maintain cover, he could not reveal his true aims. In the end, Paul succeeded in separating his followers from the Nazarenes who remained Jews. Very few Nazarenes survived the catastrophe of 70 AD, which is the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem that was predicted by Jesus in the Gospels, possibly in some in Revelation as well, that the destruction of Jerusalem, ripped stone, not two stones atop another, or something, some language to that effect, and that was a sign of his second coming. And he said that it would happen within the lifetimes of people that were listening to him. And then in 70 AD, Jerusalem is destroyed limb from limb, as Jesus describes it, by Emperor Titus, by General Titus at that time. And so that makes Titus the second coming of Jesus, according to the texts, the Gospels and War of the Jews, where it describes Titus's destruction of Jerusalem. But the point that they're making here is that very few Nazarenes survived that catastrophe. Paul may have not survived that date either, but he raised up some gifted pupils who transmitted his preaching by composing letters in his name. Marcion made use of this collection. Marcion, in turn, was attacked by a pupil of Paul, who wrote the pastoral epistles 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus. So they're saying that 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus are written by one of Paul's pupils. Now, I believe there are a few more of the epistles that are also not written by Paul, according to the most recent scholarship. And thus, these 3 letters became a part of the New Testament. So, the question of who Paul's enemies were is still open. We are not arguing that they were all Nazarenes. Nazarenes were just one of many groups. Paul admittedly had conflict with a number of his churches and with significant factions within these groups, as well as with outside groups that had attempted, with varying degrees of success, to infiltrate the Christian communities in many cities. We have tried to indicate in the text that major controversies exist. For example, Paul had many enemies, but there is no consensus over who these enemies were. Candidates include all the Jews, Jewish Christians, the radical wing of the Nazarenes, the church fathers themselves, Gnostics and divine men, meaning Hellenistic Jewish propagandists. Certainly, Paul's letters are filled with diatribes against his opponents, but the lack of evidence in the letters themselves as to who these people were has opened up an entire field of Pauline inquiry. There is no reason to assume all the opposition came from one group. There may have been opposition from many quarters. We have focused mainly on the opposition which came from the wing of the Nazarene party that saw Pauline Christianity as an opponent to Judaism. Okay, this next section is called Paul the Spy. Information given by any person about himself always has to be treated with a certain reserve, since everyone has strong motives for putting him or herself in the best possible light. and the information given about Paul in Acts requires close scrutiny, since this work was written by someone committed to the Pauline cause. We have tried to eliminate the theology, the great smokescreen of obfuscators. We are also in disagreement with those who portray Paul as so naive that he failed utterly to understand why he was being persecuted by everyone. This simply does not make sense, considering that his background must have enabled him to understand the persecutor's logic all too well. Paul's protean behavior has been noticed before. Paul has been called a spiritual scarlet pimpernel. This may be closer to the truth than even the scholar who coined the phrase suspected. In reality, the spirituality is only the cover. From the Roman point of view, Paul's real goal was political. Scholars have been reluctant to consider the political dimension of Paul. When Paul is accused of grave political charges, his defenders offer theological evidence as proof. The author of Acts constantly stresses that the political charges against Paul are unsubstantiated and irrelevant. Paul's social status has been debated, but it should be clear by now that he was no ordinary tent maker. At various points in Acts, he is treated on equal terms by 2 Roman officers, a tribune, a centurion, a city official, possibly of equestrian status in Malta, leading citizens of the province of Asia Minor, and even a governor of Cyprus. He spends the entire second half of Acts being protected by the imperial courts from accusations made by angry Jews and pagans. This is not because of his oratorical skills or his beliefs. Paul was recognized as a citizen of Rome, a man of education and culture, and he had influence with the Herodian and Roman administrations. No other Jew, Nazarene, Zealot, or Pharisee has this distinction. Everything we know about Paul must be set against the changing political climate in Judea. The unstable situation and the reliance on military intervention from Syria meant that the Roman governors of the province sought either to win the support of the Jewish elite or to control the province by force. Growing tension on Rome's eastern frontier may explain the unwillingness of Felix and Porcius Festus to commit themselves to freeing Paul in the face of Jewish opposition. They needed to keep the peace, but were they willing to give up a citizen as a source of inside intelligence just to pacify the Jews? Once we remove what one scholar calls the rose-tinted spectacles of piety, we realize that the early Christian movement was filled with all manner of zealots for the law and revolutionaries involved in the Jewish struggle for freedom. The Roman government rightly saw its job as stamping out such dangerous groups. Claudius dispatched a pro-Roman Jew, Tiberius Alexander, to assist in the pacification of Judea. And Tiberius Alexander is a strong candidate for being one of the Hellenized Jews that was working with Josephus on writing the Gospels. He was very wealthy. He was, I believe, a nephew of Philo Judaeus of Alexandria. And he was a member of the Flavian court. Among those crucified at the time were Theudas, James, and Simon, sons of the former resistance leader Judas of Galilee. Tacitus tells us that after the execution of Jesus, the sect of Christians of which he had been the founder received a blow, and for a time the growth of this dangerous superstition was checked. Now, you can't take Tacitus seriously. I wouldn't, anyway, take Tacitus seriously as a historian anymore once you look into the Roman origins hypothesis, because he was in on it. He was one of the conspirators who was writing propaganda to make the New Testament look legit. And so he's one of the handful of Roman royals who he's closely related with these people. He never became emperor, but he's one of the handful of Roman elites who have corroborating evidence of the existence of Jesus. Just really in offhand mentions and very sparingly, but nonetheless, that's what Christians have leaned upon, particularly Tacitus and Josephus. There's also Suetonius and Trajan and Pliny the Younger. Those are the only people that have ever corroborated the existence of Jesus, and they're all Roman Caesars or family members of Caesars. There is a shocking lack of evidence for the existence of Jesus. I don't believe that there is any. If somebody knows any, please let me know what it is, because all of it is Roman. But anyway, but it broke out again and spread with increased vigor. This is Christianity, according to Tacitus and these authors. But it broke out again and spread with increased vigor, not only in Judea, the soil that gave it birth, but even in the city of Rome, the common sewer into which everything infamous and abominable flowed in a torrent from all quarters of the world. The governorship of Pontius Pilate was brought to an abrupt end in 36 AD or early 37, when his superior, the legate of Syria, Vitellius, ordered him to go to Rome to answer charges brought against him by the Jews and Samaritans. Vitellius came in person to Jerusalem because the Jews were in a dangerous anti-Roman mood due to Pilate's high-handed actions. There, at the Passover of 37 AD, he deprived Caiaphas of his high priesthood. It is pertinent that in 62 AD, another high priest was deposed for illegally convening a Sanhedrin and passing a death sentence on James, the brother of Jesus, while a new governor was on the way to Judea and had given no sanction. Now, this whole story here is also very questionable, doubtful, because I believe this is coming, what they're talking about, the events of 62 AD, where James, brother of Jesus, is killed, is only in Josephus, possibly in Tacitus and Josephus, or Suetonius and Josephus, but it's not in any non-Roman source. That it's in later stuff. Yes, stuff that came out in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th century. But as far as the somewhat contemporary sources, before any type of legend can set in, the only evidence is from the Romans. We should not underestimate how difficult the governor's job was in Judea. Much of his activity had to do with uprooting undercover networks. Nor was this sedition limited to Judea. At the time of the war with Rome, Josephus records the activities in the region of Cyrene of a Messianist zealot agent, a weaver named Jonathan, who was brought up on a charge of sedition and implicated in inciting the Jews of Rome and Alexandria. including Josephus himself. When Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome, some foreign Jews, especially traveling artisans like Aquila and his wife, were particularly suspected of being messianic seditionists. Now, I think Robert Eisenman has a bead on who this Aquila is, but I cannot remember. We're going to get into some Eisenman eventually here. It is surprising how little we know about the beginnings of Christianity. The single New Testament writer who concerns himself with the experiences of the Jewish believers in Jesus, the Nazarenes, furnishes us with little more than an idealized preface to the career of Paul and the evangelization of the Gentiles. I'm guessing that's Josephus. It is clear that James was a figure of outstanding significance, but we learn hardly anything about him from the New Testament. In fact, to a large extent, the information we get about both Jesus and Paul does not come from documents originating from those Judean and Galilean communities which flourished in the formative period of the Nazarenes. We have no documents in primitive Christianity that correspond, for example, to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Only through the study of Jewish history, Roman documents, writings of the church fathers, apocryphal gospels, and various relics of lost books can we reconstruct the history of Paul's life and career. One of the most catastrophic events that had an impact on the survival of this literature and lost traditions was the Jewish struggle with Rome in 66 AD and the later revolt under Bar Kokhba in 132 AD. I think we're not going to make it any further than that. So we will return tomorrow and resume reading the conclusion of Operation Messiah. Thanks for tuning in today. Like, share, subscribe, and comment as you see fit. Come back tomorrow and learn more. Thanks for tuning in today. Have